Okay, guys. Hello to all of you once again. I'm back as promised with the lecture on Seamus Heaney's essay, The Redress of Poetry. I hope that all of you are doing fine and that the studies are going smoothly. Again, best wishes to all of you in your preparation, and just keep up the good work, and you will succeed. Okay, so let's start off with Seamus Heaney's essay, The Redress of Poetry. So, Seamus Heaney uses the word redress in two senses in this essay. The first sense of the word redress is what is that actual literal meaning of the word redress? The word redress, according to Seamus Heaney, means reparation, satisfaction, or compensation for a wrong sustained or the loss resulting from this. So it is the reparation, it is the repair of something. Now, if that's the meaning of the word redress, then redress of poetry means what can be repaired by poetry in this world, or if there is anything that needs to be repaired, if it's in a state of disrepair, then how can poetry come to help? So repairing something which is broken or something which is not in a good state, repairing it with the help of poetry. So this sense of the word repair refers to the benefit that you can get by studying poetry or by doing poetry. So redress of poetry then means redress by poetry, or the redressing effect of poetry, repairing by poetry, whatever that needs to be repaired. The second sense of the word redress, as Seamus Heaney uses it, is in the sense of how to redress poetry as poetry. If there is something wrong with poetry, how to redress poetry, how to repair poetry itself. So the first sense of the word, it refers to what else in the world can be repaired by poetry. And the second sense refers to whatever that is wrong with poetry itself, how can that be remedied? I hope the two senses are clear to you. The first sense is used by Seamus Heaney for the most part of this essay. That is the redress by poetry, the redress effected by poetry, the redressing effects of poetry, or the reparation of the wrongs through the usage of poetry. So he starts off with the essay, and he says that throughout history there have been many examples of people who have tried to prove how poetry relates to us as humans, what is the effective use of poetry, and whenever allegations against poetry have been leveled by various thinkers, through time there have been many apologists and many defenders of poetry who have tried to defend the poetry as such not useless. It is very beneficial, it is very useful. So some examples that Heaney quotes at the very start of the essays are that of Sir Philip Sidney and Wallace Stevens. Both of these eminent scholars. Sir Philip Sidney was an English poet in the 16th century, and Wallace Stevens is a contemporary poet. So Sir Philip Sidney and Wallace Stevens and all the poets who came in between these two figures, they've tried to prove to the world and to answer to the allegations leveled against poetry as to the importance of poetry. So they have all tried to defend poetry on the lines of how poetry's existence as an art form relates to our existence as citizens of society, and how it is of present use. And one of the strongest allegations against poetry comes from Plato's theory of ideas. One of the strongest allegations against poetry comes from Plato, and Plato alleged against the poets that they are useless people. Poetry is an idle mental luxury, and poetry is completely useless, according to Plato. He even banished poets from his republic, ideal republic that is, and he thought that poets did not play any useful role in the society, and poets were liars, they were immoral people, and they just preached immorality and nothing else. And according to Plato, the poets take us away from ideal or the perfect. And according to Plato, the perfect or the ideal is in the mind of God. And this world, that is the world of appearances, the world of reality, this world is not the real world. The real world is the world of ideas or the world of ideals. So this world is a copy of that world of ideal forms. And what the poets do, according to Plato, is that the poets try to copy or represent things in the world. So in this sense, the poetry is twice removed from reality. These were the allegations against poets and the poetry by Plato. Now, Heaney has to defend poetry against these allegations of Plato. So Heaney comes up with the retort that Plato is against poetry, no doubt, but Plato himself has resorted to the theory of ideal forms, and Plato has done his philosophy, and Plato's philosophy is based on the theory of ideal forms. Isn't that a work of imagination just like poetry? That is the question that Seamus Heaney asks. Quite a valid question, because indeed Plato's theory of ideal forms is also a work of imagination just like poetry. And so if Plato disparages poets and poetry on the basis of just this allegation that poetry is a work of imagination, it has no real connection with reality, well then Plato's work the theory of ideal forms, that is also a work of imagination. And Plato claims that his work, the theory of ideal forms, that tries to redress or repair or compensate whatever is wrong or whatever is exudating in the real world. Well, if that is the case, then poetry does it as well, because poetry is also imaginative. So this is the defense of poetry by Seamus Heaney against Plato's allegations. Moving further, so Seamus Heaney continues on and says that in the same way, other works of imagination, such as poetic fictions and the dream of alternative world, that there can be a better world than this, at least in our imagination. So all these imaginative thoughts and the conception of ideal world, they help the governments and the revolutionaries alike. So then the allegation that imagination or any work of imagination could not be of real use is totally baseless, because what we have seen is that imaginative works, imaginative thoughts, and the conception of the ideal world has helped both the governments and the revolutionaries a lot in their quests. So these are not as useless as they're alleged by Plato. However, there is one difference. The governments and the revolutionaries, no doubt that they're enabled in their quests by these by the imaginative works such as poetry and the dream of a world that could be better than this one. However, they compel the society, the governments and the revolutionaries, they compel the society to take on their own shape of imagining. They want the society to think just like them, and obviously this is not possible. On the other hand, the poets don't do this. Poets don't force people or the readers to subscribe to their thinking. Poets are more concerned with figuring forth or with presenting what is possible or desirable in this world through their poetry. So in other words, what poets do is poets give a picture of an ideal world, a world of all possibilities, which is perfect, unlike this real world. And both the governments and the revolutionaries, they benefit from ideal conceptions of such worlds as given by poetry. So one thing should be clear in your mind, that until now, what we've covered is that poetry gives us the picture of an ideal world, a perfect world, which is far removed from this real world. The real world is not ideal. It is full of miseries and troubles. It is not perfect. It is imperfect. Poetry shows you an ideal world where everything is possible. That is the bigger hand, the upper hand that the poetry has over the real world. It is the world of possibilities, because it is totally imaginative. Okay? So poetry shows whatever is possible, imaginable, or desirable. That is not present in this world, lacking in this world, unneeded. And now, up till now, Seamus Heaney has presented the use of poetry, and Seamus Heaney has clearly asserted that poetry is not useless. Poetry gives you a picture of the ideal world, and those people who allege that poetry is useless, well, poetry helps. Poetry is not useless. Poetry helps governments. Poetry helps revolutionaries in forming and pursuing their ideal conceptions of the world, and in trying to correct whatever is exurbating or whatever is wrong in this world. That is done through imagination, through the conceptions of such an ideal world as put forth by poetry. So that is the first use of poetry, and that is the first answer to any such allegation that poetry is baseless. Now, over here, Seamus Heaney quotes Wallace Stevens, one of our contemporary poets, and Wallace Stevens says that poetry is a violence from within which protects us from violence without. So poetry is a violence from within. It is inside of you. It is your emotions, the powerful emotion that you have inside of you. And whenever you do poetry, these emotions are transcribed, put forth on the piece of paper, and they are laid down on that piece of paper. And that outlet of emotions which poetry gives a poet, that prevents the poet from resorting to external violence. So poetry protects the poet from engaging in any act of external violence, because whatever internal violence that might be inside of a poet, that is projected outward and laid out on the piece of paper when he does the poetry. So this is another benefit of poetry. This is another redressing effect of poetry, another use of poetry. So whenever we discuss a use of poetry or a benefit of poetry, keep in mind that we are talking about redressing effect of poetry, or redressed by poetry. And a third argument is that poetry is the imagination which presses back against the pressure of reality. So reality is very pressurizing. It is very stringent. It is very strict. It is very limiting. But poetry is the world of imagination. It is a world of all possibilities. It gives you a world of all possibilities. It unlimits, it unrestrains, it liberates all the innate capacities. It has a liberating effect against the miseries and the torments and the sufferings of reality. You can find consolation and solace in the ideal, the perfect world given forth by poetry, but not in the real world of miseries. This is another use of poetry. Now, another allegation against poetry comes from a heckler. Now, who is a heckler? Let's ponder on that. A heckler is someone who tries to unsettle a speaker through derisive comments. Or in other words, who interrupts a speaker or a proponent or an advocate of a particular standpoint. So a heckler, a disaffected or dissatisfied heckler, might say that poetry is only aesthetic stuff. It is of no practical use. It is an aesthetic activity, rather luxury, and it is a mystic activity. It is a strange activity which cannot be utilized, or it cannot be put to any pragmatic or practical use by the common people, because it is so mystified, it is so strange, and it is only aesthetic. Its impact is only aesthetic, satisfy one's aesthetic sense. And the basis of heckler's protest is that the heckler believes that man's destiny can only be changed in terms of the political scenario that he is in. So if heckler believes that poetry cannot come to any help to man, why? Because until and unless you change the prevailing political scenario surrounding a person, which cannot be done by poetry, according to heckler, there is no way that poetry can change a man's destiny. Now, obviously, he's going to disagree with heckler on this, because, see, what heckler believes in politics of subversion. Right? Heckler believes in politics of subversion, and heckler believes that what poetry should be doing, in heckler's point of view, is that poetry should assume all the voices that have been denied voice thus far. Poetry should assume any voice that has been denied voice thus far in the political sphere, and only by proclaiming that political voice, heckler believes that the man's destiny can be improved. So, in other words, heckler does not want poetry to be a mere imagined response to the conditions of the world. Heckler wants poetry to be practical. To put it in simple words, heckler wants poetry to be a propaganda, either of the rightist or the leftist. Heckler wants poetry to be siding with a particular manifesto of a particular political party, because heckler believes that unless poetry takes significant part in politics, man's destiny cannot be changed. So a poet must favor a particular political party, or he should be active in politics if he needs to be wants to contribute towards improvement of man. So heckler insists that poetry should be an applied art rather than an imaginative art, and that poetry should be employed as much as possible in order to alleviate all the distressing movements and conditions by direct political action. So heckler wants to rouse people on direct action, or you can say on sedition or treason, because he wants poetry to be stimulating, to be inducing people to take action, rather than showing them a dream of the alternative world, which is perfect than this world of ours. Wallace Stevens, a contemporary poet, he does not believe with the heckler. He is also going to defend the allegation leveled against poetry by heckler. And Wallace Stevens comes to the aid of poetry, comes to the defense of poetry, and he says that a poet is not a useless person. Why? Because a poet creates an imaginary world in which we find comfort, in which we find solace. And without that imaginary world, we cannot conceive of the reality that surrounds us. So it helps us in understanding the complete picture of reality. And the real world is like a labyrinth. It's like a maze, a very complicated maze, and sometimes we find ourselves unable to pass, unable to find a free path in this entangled maze, and the maze or the labyrinth seems impassable to us. In other words, sometimes in real life we get frustrated and our desires and ambitions get thwarted. We don't get to achieve what we want in real life, but we do that. We can do it in imagination, can't we? So that is the edge of poetry. Even a beggar in his imagination can think of himself as a prince. Isn't that an edge of imagination over reality? Certainly is. So what poetry does is poetry could show us a labyrinth, but not an impassable one, rather a passable one. So poetry can remove all the miseries, all the problems that exist, or poetry can show us the alternatives to this real world, to the problems of this real world, because it is a work of imagination, and imagination, everything is possible. So now, according to Wallace Stevens, if poetry helps us by giving us a picture of the imaginary world, then clearly poetry does not intervene in the real world, in the actual world. Now what Heckler wants poetry's role to be is that Heckler wants poetry to directly intervene in the real world through direct action by the people. But Wallace Stevens, just like Seamus Heaney, believes that this is not the role of poetry. Poetry does not intervene in the actual world. Rather, it gives you an ideal picture of what the things should be like in this world. And what's the use of it? Well, when you are shown an ideal picture of how the world should be, this gives you a chance to recognize whatever is wrong in this world and how to correct it. So it gives you the chance to recognize your predicaments or difficult situations. It gives man the chance to foreknow his capacities or whatever he could affect, and to rehearse his comeback in all kinds of venturesome or daring ways. So it lets you rehearse your comeback, resurgence. It lets you think of various resurgent ways to how to come to your own rescue. That is the true value of poetry according to Wallace Stevens. When it shows you the ideal world, it lets you know how to counter the problems in the real world. And as such, it does constitute a useful event, doesn't it? And so, the poetry, the ideal world that it shows, it is a response to the limited, constricted world of miseries of reality. And so it is a response which has clearly liberating effect on us and on the individual spirit. So this is the use of poetry then. And Seamus Heaney has enumerated Wallace Stevens' standpoint and advocated this standpoint. So this is another redressing effect of poetry, or redress by poetry, that it offers you a chance to recognize whatever is wrong in this world and to figure out ways to try to correct those problems. However, the heckler or the political activist, he is not going to agree with Seamus Heaney or Wallace Stevens. The political activist or any worker of any political party would want poetry to be articulating of their own viewpoint. They would want poetry to articulate their slogans, the slogans of their political party. That is all the political parties want. So a political activist would, in reply to Seamus Heaney, he would allege that, you see the style of Seamus Heaney, the prose style of Seamus Heaney. Seamus Heaney has written this prose work in a cross-argumentative way. So he presents an argument, then he rebuts it through his own stance or by quoting some other person, a writer like Wallace Stevens. So this is the cross-argumentative style of Seamus Heaney. Now, the political activist would allege against poetry that poetry is useless because there is no point in imagining a world if it cannot be materialized, and if there's no point in imagining a better state of affairs if poetry cannot produce new events or new state of affairs. But see, how political activist is not right in this case is that political activist is talking about what he wants the world to be, what his particular political party wants. He wants poetry to be the spokesperson of the slogan or the manifesto of his own ideology. In other words, he wants poets to speak whatever the political activist's ideology is. Every political party has its own ideology, and so every political party wants poetry to be on their side, or a particular poet on their side, voicing their own agenda. And so these political parties, they are clearly not satisfied with poetry presenting an ideal image of the world. Rather, what they insist is that poetry, instead of giving us the inventive or the original, the inventive world or the imaginary world which is ideal, they want poetry, or they want the redressing effect of poetry, or the use of poetry, to be an exercise of leverage on the behalf of their own point of view. So they want poetry to be articulating their point of view only, whereas Seamus Heaney retorts that poetry should not be limited to any particular political party's agenda or manifesto. Rather, poetry is a comprehensive concept. It should be all-inclusive. True poetry should not be focusing on one political party or the stance of a particular political party. It should be focusing on the complex reality. Reality is never simple. You have to take into consideration the stances of all the political parties, not just one. So that is the retort of Seamus Heaney. And now this was a point of debate. A political activist would say that good poetry is such that advocates or that voices his political party's concerns or his political party's stance, whereas Seamus Heaney says that this is not what true poetry should be doing. But in general, you know as well as I know that there is strong pressure on poets. There has been pressure throughout the history to voice the opinion of the government. In Russell's essay, The Role of a Teacher, you have read that governments always pressurize teachers to follow their own particular ideology. In the same way, there is pressure on artists and poets by the governments whenever the governments undertake a particular activity. For example, in the World War I, there was pressure on English poets. There was pressure on English poets to dehumanize the face of Germans. Why? Because clearly England was up against Germany in World War I. So clearly, only because of this state of enmity, the hostility, only because of that, there was strong pressure on English poets and part of English governments to criticize caustically the Germans, no matter if it was to be on principle or not. Similarly, in the wake of 1916 executions, talking about Easter Rising that took place in Ireland in 1916, clearly there was a pressure on the Irish poets to criticize the tyranny of the British executors or British Army. Similarly, in the Vietnam War, which took place in the 1950s and 60s, in the Vietnam War, the pressure was on American poets to support the standpoint of the government. So this happens. And Seamus Heaney says that this should really not be. Poets should not be pressured to voice the agenda as a particular government or particular political parties. That is not the job of a poet. That is the job of a political activist. And so they are seeking the redress of poetry in the wrong way. This is not the redressing of poetry that poetry should be restricted to. And so, if there were any countervailing opinion makers around that time, if there were some poets who did not want to be subjugated by the official ideology imposed on them by the government, well, then they were not looked with favorable eye. They were looked as traitors. They were branded as traitors. And so, clearly, if any English poet wanted to see Germans as friends and as secretaries, this was not acceptable to the British government. In the case of the Irish struggle, Easter Rising, if an Irish poet wanted to see the British government as a body who might keep its promise, this would not be acceptable to the Irish leaders. If in the case of the Vietnam War, an American poet decided not to side with the official American ideology, but rather portrayed that move as a form of imperial betrayal on part of America, American government would not like that poet to voice that kind of contrary or opposite opinion. But there have been poets over time who do not submit to the strain of the official opinion, who say no whenever the governments try to threat them or the governments want them to voice their opinion, who say no, who rather come up with their own countervailing gestures, counteracting opinions. And the political activist believes that you have to side with the force of gravity. That is the opinion of the majority. That is, a poet has to go with the government's ideology. That is what a political activist believes. But Seamus Heaney says in reply that even if a poet does not go with the official ideology of the government, still his poetry can be of use. Now, the political activist believes that if a poet does not follow the government's or the political party's ideology, then the poetry can be of no use, because political activist wants poetry to be thoroughly in line with his political party's agenda manifesto, and obviously a government always wants a poet to be voicing whatever the government's policies are, preferences are, and they consider the usefulness of poetry only when the poets voice their opinions, not when they voice contrary opinions. But Seamus Heaney replies that that is not the case. Even when the poet does not agree with a particular government standpoint, a particular political party standpoint, and rather, even if a poet decides to voice the opposite opinion, it still can be useful. It still can be useful. Why? Because such counteracting or countervailing gestures on part of poets, they do have political force. Even though it might be the force of minority, but still, they have their voice, they have their force. And the very power of that force to aggravate, intensify, or exacerbate the political scenario is a guarantee of their usage. So even if the bottom line is, even if a poet is voicing opposite opinion to that of his government or his political party, even if a poet is voicing opposite opinion to that of his political party or his government, still it could be useful. It could be politically effective and could affect a change. This, according to Seamus Heaney, is the working of a law given by Simone Weil, a French philosopher. And what is that law? That law is, according to Simone Weil, if we know in what way the society is unbalanced, we must do whatever we can to add weight to the lighter scale. Okay, and why should we do it? We shouldn't be supportive of the force of gravity. We should add weight to the lighter scale, only to bring the system to an equilibrium. So you know that if one scale, you might have seen physical balance, it has two scales. If one scale is heavier, the other is lighter, then what is the way to achieve the equilibrium? By putting weight into the lighter scale. So this is what Simone Weil is advocating, that in order to come to a state of equilibrium, one should put weight to the lighter scale. And according to Seamus Heaney, poetry as well manifests the working of Weil's law. Simone Weil believes that obedience to the force of gravity is the greatest sin. A poet should never be submitting or obedient or groveling or suck up to the force of gravity. That is the opinion of the government, the force of the majority, the force of the major political party. That, according to Simone Weil, is the greatest sin ever. I need a timeout, okay? Hi, so this is part 2 of Seamus Heaney's essay, Redress of Poetry. And till the end of part 1, we had been discussing that how poetry too manifests the working of Weil's law. And Weil's law is that in order to effect a redress by poetry, you have to add weight to the lighter scale, or in simple words, you have to side with the weaker side, with the deserving side in any circumstance, in any scenario, and you must not be succumbed. You must not submit or be subjugated by the pressure of the majority or the force of gravity, which could be the government or the major political party. Rather, a poet should act conscientiously, and a poet should analyze the whole situation and see which side is deserving, and then support that cause. So this idea of counterveighing or balancing out of the forces, this is the redress by poetry in the eyes of Simone Weil, and this is another form of redress by poetry that Seamus Heaney has listed in his essay. And obviously, the reason why you put weight to the lighter side is because you want the system to come to equilibrium, a transcendent equilibrium in this case. Now, if you are putting weight into the lighter side, that is, you are supporting the weaker side, it might be the case that the weaker side is currently not in power. So in other words, you are supporting a cause which has not been realized yet. The other side, the heavier side, might already be in place. And so by doing poetry, what you are doing is that you are trying to put forward a form of reality that is only imagined, that is not real, because the form of reality which is real is what you're trying to balance out in the first place by adding weight to the lighter side, because you're not satisfied with the prevalent form of reality. Now, how does that imagined reality has an effect to balance out the actual reality? That is the question. So Seamus Heaney answers this question quite nicely. He says that doing poetry which envisages such an ideal reality that pertains to the lighter scale or the weaker side, that is, in other words, putting forward a glimpsed alternative or a revelation of potential which is not in place at the moment. In other words, through the poetry, the poet is trying to support a cause which is not yet materialized, which is only in the mind, which is only existing in the form of poetry but hasn't been realized yet. But merely by its putting forward in the form of poetry, merely by its projection in the form of poetry, it does constitute a beneficial effect, and that is the redress by poetry in this case. So that potential which the poet envisages through his poetry, that weaker side which the poet wants to see win in the conflict, that is the vision of the poet, that the poet wants that counter reality, that imagined reality, or the weaker side, to come out on top, to be the ultimate victor. So that is the vision of the poet. That is how a poet tries to balance out the stronger force or the prevalent reality. So that is one way that poetry can come to affecting a redress. So to conclude it, this form of redress is constituted in that the poet puts forward a glimpsed alternative or a revelation of potential that is being denied by the prevalent circumstances. And the vision might realize soon, or it may take some time. So in some instances, a poet has to even wait to see if the vision that he has been projecting in his poetry, when that vision actually gets materialized. So some poets wait for years, some poets see their vision materialize, but there are many who don't really get to see their vision materialize in their age, but only later their thoughts are taken up by others and realized. So okay, that was another form of redress of by poetry. So now Seamus Heaney comes to the present century, that is the last century, the 20th century. So he says that there are many poets, contemporary poets, like Wilfred Owen, Irina Redress, and a Russian poet, many others, who have exercised that last form of redress, that is, that they have disobeyed the force of gravity in accordance with Wales' law. Wales' law is the same, that you have to disobey the force of gravity. You have to support the lighter or the weaker side, or you have to project a counter-reality which could alleviate the crisis of the present reality. So poets such as Wilfred Owen and Irina Redress have all tried. In their works, they have all put forward visions of alternative worlds that they would like to see in place of this real world, and they would like to see their visions get materialized someday. So they are visionary poets. They have exercised this form of redress by poetry. Others include Osen Mendelssohn, Czeslaw Milosz. So these guys, specifically the last two, Osip Mendelssohn and Czeslaw Milosz, for them, the redress of poetry comes to represent an exercise of the virtue of hope. For these two poets, the redress of poetry, the redressing effect of poetry, or the redress by poetry, is actually exercising the virtue of hope, that is, keeping faith that things will turn out for the better sooner or later. Václav Havel, he says that poetry and hope are synonymous. So Václav Havel has said about poetry that it is just like hope. Poetry, the major role or the major redressing effect of poetry is giving hope by projecting an alternative ideal world, by projecting a probable solution. And hope, which is synonymous with poetry, it is a state of mind, not a state of this real world. It is a state of the soul. And being a state of the spirit, it transcends this real world. So whenever a poet puts forward a hope in his poem or poetry, he projects a transcendent world, a world that is not real, but he hopes for that imagined world to become real, because that imagined world is obviously in some way or the other better than the real world. So that redressing effect of poetry is in fact an exercise of hope on part of the poet. So the deepest roots of poetry in this sense of redress are in the transcendental. And the poet, when he puts forward that ideal imagined world with the hope that it could be the answer to the problems of the real world, the poet does not know whether his hope of that ideal world will materialize. What he knows is that his hope or that ideal world makes sense. So that the projected ideal world, whether it turns out to be in the end materialized or not, that is not a concern for the poet. What matters is if it makes sense, if it is really sensibly, if it could really be sensibly thought to be able to alleviate the crisis in the real world. This is one form of redress, that is the exercise of hope. So now Seamus Heaney quotes some more names, and here you see this referential style of Seamus Heaney, this elusive style of Seamus Heaney, historical style, that he quotes examples from history. He quotes other poets from history as well as from contemporary times. So he quotes two big names, Douglas Dunn and Anne Stevenson, both are renowned contemporary poets. So he says that when the contemporary poets such as Anne Stevens and Douglas Dunn, they set to writing poetry. Their main concern is not to impose their will upon their work. In other words, they're not directed by their will consciously. Rather, for them, poetry is all about creation. It is about letting the subconscious break away of the shackles and put on paper directly whatever comes from the subconscious without the mediation of the conscious mind. So they are not perplexed by the questions of poetics. They let their unconscious or subconscious take over, and they're not guided by their will as well. And so the main goal that they're directed towards the achievement of is that of making, creating, because poetry is a creative process. So that is what their principal aim is, and not just any making, but delightful making. So the main purpose for the contemporary poets, according to Seamus Heaney, the purpose of poetry is delightful creation. It is not putting forward a particular ideology. It is not siding with a particular political stance. Rather, the main function, the main redress, the main use of poetry is to give people or the reader delight. And obviously, once the poem has been put down on the piece of paper, naturally afterwards it has been created. It becomes a source of wisdom when one tries to dig into its thematic content. But that is not the primary concern for the poet. The primary concern is delight, and delight is affected by purely linguistic means. Poems do delight us through their cadences, that is rhythm, through the chain reaction of their rhymes. So these are
the delightful devices which the poets employ.
Then etymological nuances, etymological innovations. And when the poet is in the process of creating subconsciously, his primary concern is in delightful making, rather than critically judging at any point what he's writing about, or whether whatever he has written makes sense or not. No. The poets, contemporary poets, their primary concern is with delightful making, not with critical analysis upfront, or with conscious projection of a particular cause or particular stance in their mind. And this is supported by W.H. Auden as well, who is a famous American poet. And W.H. Auden also says he actually put forth a trinity of poetic faculties. That is, W.H. Auden, according to W.H. Auden, there are three poetic faculties. The first one is making, that is creation. The second one is judging, and the third one is knowing. So according to W.H. Auden as well, the primary poetic faculty is making, delightful creation. That is the primary tool for a poet. Judging comes later. Knowing also. Judging means to say critical analysis of what has been written. It comes later, after creation. And knowing what has been put forward in that piece of poetry, knowing comes even later than judging. So making is the primary, delightful making is the primary concern for a poet. So this is another redress by poetry, that poetry delights. And then, after delighting, poetry becomes a source of wisdom, because when you're done with making, you judge what you have made, and then you come to know its true essence of it. So it leads to wisdom. So the movement is from delight to wisdom. Poetry delights you first, and then you achieve wisdom afterwards. Isn't this a benefit of poetry? It is. So this is another benefit or use of poetry, and this is an answer of Seamus Heaney to the critics who say that poetry is of no use. Well, poetry is of use, says Seamus Heaney. It delights you, it gives you wisdom. What else you could ask? Okay, so now, for those poets who try to use poetry as a tool to project their political causes or the voice of gravity, they are in the danger of risking the integrity of poetry. Because according to W.H. Auden, according to Seamus Heaney, the integrity of poetry, the fundamental purpose of poetry is in delightful creation. It is in its self-delighting inventiveness, its joy in being a process of language. The fundamental purpose of poetry is not judging or knowing or gaining wisdom. It is only in delightful creation, being a process of language as well as representation of things in the world. And according to W.B. Yeats, who was a famous Irish poet, according to W.B. Yeats as well, a poet's work must not be dictated by any particular will. That is, he should not will to do poetry on certain topics only. That should be dictated by his subconscious. So in W.B. Yeats' terms, the will must not usurp the work of imagination. He should let his imagination flow freely rather than pinpointing and dictating the imagination. So this is what the role of a true poet is, and what true poetry is, that it should be spontaneous, according to W.B. Yeats. And Seamus Heaney concurs. Seamus Heaney says that poetry cannot afford to lose its fundamental purpose, which is delighting inventiveness. Now, what has been happening in this late 20th century is that there has been a movement to write poems on politically approved themes, and in the aftermath of colonial era, there is post-colonial backlash. And so all kinds of revolutionary poetry is being produced in the world today. Seamus Heaney says that it is true that poetry is being used in the present era. Poetry is mostly being applied for political purposes, to voice political concerns, and poetry is being pressed to give voice or to give expression to those ethnic, social, sexual, and political concerns which in the past were not given, which were in the past were denied voice. So poetry is pressed to voice their concerns in our times. And this is the redress by poetry that the current poets, that the contemporary poets, most of them are seeking. That is, the contemporary poets are seeking the redressing effect of poetry, or the benefit of poetry, in its application to political, sexual, ethnic, and social concerns. But Seamus Heaney says that they are limiting the scope of poetry by doing this. Poetry is not just about ethnic, social, sexual, and political concerns. Poetry is all-inclusive. Poetry includes everything, all concerns. It should not be limited to just ethnic, social, sexual, political life. Now, for the contemporary poets, the contemporary poets believe that they are doing good, making good use of poetry, and they are redressing the ills, the ethnic ills, social, sexual ills, political ills, through the application of poetry. But Seamus Heaney, and they are correcting the injustices through this redressing effect of poetry. But Seamus Heaney insists that in doing so, the poets are risking poetry's integrity itself. Poetry is under threat, in danger of losing its fundamental identity, fundamental purpose, which was delightful creation. So poetry is in danger of losing that purpose, and poetry was actually meant to form its own category, but in discharging the function of giving ethnic, social, sexual, and political voices through poetry, poets are risking poetry to set up as its own category. In other words, if the current poets continue voicing ethnic, social, sexual concerns through poetry, poetry might not remain true poetry. Poetry might not remain the original linguistic expression it used to be. Rather, poetry is in danger of becoming a source of propaganda. Now, this is serious. So Heaney believes that if continually poetry is applied to ethnic, social, and sexual political lives, then poetry will lose its identity. It will become a form of propaganda, and this was not meant to be poetry's original function. Now, not that it is not possible for poetry to promote these political, cultural causes, and yet be fully artistically integral at the same time. Poetry can promote these cultural and political causes, and yet at the same time be full of artistic integrity. So in other words, artistic integrity can go side by side with the promotion of cultural and political themes. It is possible, according to Seamus Heaney, and why it is possible, because we have seen in the past that Irish poetry has been all about the projection of Irish nationalism, and so the Irish poets, they have been doing nationalistic poetry to promote the Irish cause. So that is the form of redress, or redressing effect of poetry, that the Irish poets have been seeking. But Seamus Heaney believes that poetry's scope must not be narrowed. I mean, that is one use of poetry. Fine, but if you want to use poetry for nationalistic concerns, do it. Allama Iqbal did it in Pakistan's case. W.B. Yeats did it in the history of Ireland. If you want to put it to nationalistic purpose only, you can do it. But that should not be the only purpose of poetry. And if you keep on applying poetry to nationalistic causes, it is in the danger of becoming a propaganda and losing its original identity. So that is not true redress by poetry in the eyes of Seamus Heaney. So what we are seeing at present is that in emergent cultures, nationalistic poetry is the norm. And W.B. Yeats, famous name, his poetry was nationalistic. He was, by the way, he is a celebrated poet, a renowned poet. So it's not that you can do nationalistic poetry or you can do poetry on political themes. You can do so, but Seamus Heaney says that poetry should not be narrowed down in its application to only just political concepts or political concerns. He quotes two famous names: Thomas MacDonagh, who was a professor of English at the University of Dublin, and James Joyce. Now, although they were extremely critical of the English Empire, being Irish nationalists, they were extremely critical of the British Empire's domination of Ireland, and they tried to resist it through their work. But they could not deny that supreme authority of English. Rather, they could not deny the charm of English language. Rather, even if they challenged the British Empire, they used the English language for that purpose. So, in the context of the scope and the function of poetry, why are these two names important? Well, because Seamus Heaney believes that if some poet at a particular time is using poetry to promote his particular nationalistic cause, poetry should not be blamed for that. The integrity of poetry should not be called into question just because a particular person is basing his poetry on a particular nationalistic theme, or using that poetry as a propaganda. Poetry is not to be discredited, because it is not poetry that is at fault, but its false use. That is, poetry is only being applied to disparage and to speak critically of a discredited cultural political system. So that is the danger that poetry is under, that if we take it too far, take its application to nationalistic or political themes too far, it is in danger of losing its original identity. That is the standpoint of Seamus Heaney. And according to Seamus Heaney, what is the fully realized poetry? What is the ideal poetry then in the eyes of Seamus Heaney? Well, Seamus Heaney says that poetry has to be a model of all-inclusive consciousness. It should not be limited to particular ethnic, political, social, or sexual causes. Rather, it should include everything, all causes, not just one nationalistic movement. Its scope should be wide, because reality is complex. Reality is composed of every cause, every concern, not just a particular ethnic or social cause. Reality is very complex. To quote an example of that fully realized poetry, Seamus Heaney says that the Divine Comedy is an example of that totally adequate kind of poetry. And that totally adequate kind of poetry, what it does is that it puts forward a world. It puts forward a world that is imagined, but a world which is free from the miseries and the problems of the real world. And that fully realized poetry is, in this sense, fulfilling its counterweighting function. What was the counterweighting function? The counterweighting function was Simone Weil's law, that you have to put weight into the lighter scale. That is, you have to imagine a reality which is ideal, which is perfect, disobeying the force of gravity. Whatever is exacerbating or aggravated in this real world, a poet has to imagine an ideal world to balance out the real world. So that is the counterweighting function of poetry. This is the redress by poetry. This is the fully realized poetry that Seamus Heaney propounds. So what would be the benefit of that poetry? Well, according to Seamus Heaney, that fully realized poetry, before that poetry, we would be able to see ourselves and understand our existence in a much better way. This real world has flaws. When a poet tries to balance this real world out, or the shortcomings of this real world are tried to be balanced out by the poet, he, in a way, endeavors for our more comprehensive understanding of our dilemmas and miseries, the problems we face in the real world. That is what he aims at. That is the role of the totally adequate kind of poetry in Seamus Heaney's point of view. And Seamus Heaney says that the evidence of having witnessed a specimen of fully realized poetry is that the experience is very bracing and very memorable. Now, Seamus Heaney, continuing on in his elusive style, he quotes George Louis Borges, Argentinian poet, who propounded that the taste of the apple lies in the contact of the apple with the palate. So, the taste of the apple lies in the contact of the apple with the palate. Palate is the upper part of the roof. In the same way, and the taste doesn't lie in the fruit. In the same way, the taste of poetry, or the excitement, the relish, that you get out of a particular piece of poetry is only when that piece of poetry meets a particular reader. Just like the taste of the fruit is in its contact with the palate of the mouth, the taste of a poetry, the joy of the poetry, is in the contact of that piece of poetry with the reader. So the taste or the meaning of the poetry or the delight of poetry is not on in the lines of symbols printed on a page or printed on the pages of that poetry book. No, the joy is not in the page. The joy is in the contact, in reading out of that piece of poetry by a particular reader. And when a reader gets to read a piece of poetry that is fully realized in Seamus Heaney's point of view, when a reader gets to read such poetry, he is fortunate to experience a certain sort of thrill, which is called as physical emotion that comes with each reading. So Seamus Heaney says that when you read that fully realized poetry, you are overcome by physical emotion. And what is the nature of that physical emotion when you read that truly realized poetry? Well, the nature is that it fulfills our need to recover past experience that we long for, or to prefigure a future. What does that mean? See, we've already discussed that this world is not ideal. It is flawed. It has very shortcomings. Sometimes it happens that when we look back retrospectively, we think of the past as having been better than the present. So we long for that lost past. That happens. Some people always are seen saying that they would love to have their past reclaimed. Then there are some people who always look to the future. They are going through suffering in this real world, and they say that they would like to see a future in which there are no such constraints or suffering. So some people want to recover a past, some people want to prefigure a future. How is it possible? In reality, it might not be possible. You can't go back to the past. You can't go to the future. But through poetry it is possible. So that is the physical emotion that gets hold of you when you read that fully realized poetry, which has been defined by Seamus Heaney. That physical emotion, or the thrill, it fulfills your need to either recover a past or to prefigure a future. Every one of us lies in either of these two categories. So when we read that fully realized poetry, that need to either recover a past or to prefigure a future, that is fulfilled. Now, that physical emotion comes when the reader reads a specimen of a fully realized poetry. In other words, connection of that fully realized poetry and the reader causes this physical emotion or thrill. So, what is the true redress of poetry then? What is the true redress of poetry? Talk about that in part 3, the final part of this video lecture. Stay tuned. Thank you. Hi guys, back with the third and the final video on Seamus Heaney's The Redress of Poetry. At the end of the last lecture, we were discussing the truest redressing effect of poetry. What is the true benefit of poetry, or the true reparation of poetry in Seamus Heaney's point of view? Obviously, that would have to come from that fully realized poetry. So, and what is the fully realized poetry? We discussed that fully realized poetry is a poetry which fulfills the counter-rating function of Simone Weil, which puts forward a truth which we can resort to in order to understand our position in the real world. We could resort to that countervailing ideal reality that has been put forward as part of that fully realized poetry. So when you get to read that fully realized poetry, it is then that it fulfills your need to either recover a past or prefigure a future through its physical emotion. And when it does that, when that fully realized poetry is able to produce a physical emotion inside of the reader, a physical emotion which fulfills the reader's need to either recover the past or prefigure the future, that is the truest redressing effect of poetry in Seamus Heaney's viewpoint. So at the heart of any memorable reading of that fully realized poetry, this is possible. And when that happens, all the faculties of a person are provoked, and this is a delightful experience. And one seems to recover a past or prefigure a future when one gets to read such kind of fully realized poetry. So this is the best redressing, or in other words, the only redressing effect, legitimate redressing effect of poetry in Seamus Heaney's point of view. And when that happens, when this physical emotion or thrill gets hold of the reader, to quote George Seferis said that poetry is strong enough to help. Now when that happens, when the physical emotion is experienced by the reader, when he gets to read the fully realized poetry, that is the point when the redress springs into action or comes to be in the fully realized sense. That is the best, or the only most legitimate redressing effect you could ever find from poetry. Now, in the later part of this essay, Seamus Heaney discusses a famous poet, metaphysical poet, George Herbert, who was a contemporary of John Donne. And why is the Seamus Heaney quote him? Well, because Seamus Heaney believes that he is one such undisappointing poet who has done that fully realized poetry that is able to produce that physical emotion or thrill in the reader. So he quotes a number of poems of George Herbert. And you can read off from the text or from any book the poems that he quotes of George Herbert's work. Seamus Heaney believes that George Herbert exemplifies what that fully realized poetry is. And that fully realized poetry, once again, to recap, is that puts forward an imagined world that lets us understand the complex burden of our experience in the real world. So in other words, in fully realized poetry, the poet puts forward an ideal imagined world, which tries to solve all the contradictions and the complexities that we face in the real world. That is, through its countervailing function. So that is the fully realized poetry, and George Herbert, according to Heaney, is a personification or emblem of such kind of poetry. Now, George Herbert's poetry contains wise and witty transformations, and George Herbert was very much worked up, or very much enamored of the antithesis that exists in the world. He was very much excited, and that is the thing that was the source of inspiration for his poetry. All kinds of paradoxes and the antithesis in nature, like creator versus creature, heaven versus earth, soul versus body, time versus eternity, life versus death, Christ versus man. So all these kinds of paradoxes really excited him, and that was the basis for his poetry in the first place. And why does Seamus Heaney speaks appreciatively of George Herbert's poetry? Well, because in his poetry, language comes to life. His poetry constitutes awakened language. It is not dead language. It's language that is alive. And since Borges put forward that point that there is a physical emotion that is associated with a fully realized poetry, and in Seamus Heaney's point of view, the physical emotion that comes through the reading of George Herbert's works, it derives from the language life of his poems. His poems are animated in their language. They have structural animation as well. So that is what creates the physical emotion in the reader. And what really inspired George Herbert was these contradictions in reality, the antithesis that we've already talked about. And then some of the elements which constitute the physical emotion, or some of the hallmarks of George Herbert's poetry, is the tensions, the reversals, the balances, then relaxation subsequent to tensions, sinuous dialogues, right? So these are the points, these are the elements which make George Herbert's poetry a true representative of that fully realized poetry that Seamus Heaney has put forward a conception of in the earlier part of this lecture. So, as I explained in the early part of this lecture, so to cut short, George Herbert's work is volatile, and it is leveraged, or it is exercised by his wit and his wisdom equally. And wit is necessary to create a delightful thing. So wit is behind delightful creation, and the first purpose of function of a poet is, well, the first functional element of poetry is creating or making. Then the function is judging, and the third function is knowing, according to W.H. Auden. And it is the creative aspect that gives us the delight. So wit is behind his creative delight, and we also gain, the reader also gains wisdom for judging and knowing George Herbert's works. So that is uh, delight and wisdom. They are also constituting parts of that fully realized poetry. That fully realized poetry gives us delight, it gives us wisdom, it gives us an opportunity to experience that physical emotion, that thrill, which fulfills our need to prefigure a past, to recover a past or to prefigure a future. And these are the hallmarks of George Herbert's poetry. So the first poem of George Herbert that Seamus Heaney quotes in this essay is The Pulley. And in The Pulley, one of the artistic elements is a pun on the word rest, and you can read about that from the text, not that difficult you can. And the basic idea behind pulley is life houses pulley-like exchange of forces. And in the same way, there's a pulley-like exchange of forces between the humanity and God. Right? So you can read about that from the text. Why does he mentions the pulley from George Herbert's verse? Because the pulley incorporates the essence of what a specimen of fully realized poetry could be. And obviously, we talked about that George Herbert was worked up by the contradictions and the antitheses, paradoxes in the real world, so his poetry is all about the explication of these paradoxes. Another poem of George Herbert is The Collar, that has been mentioned in the essay by Seamus Heaney. This is also another specimen of George Herbert's craftsmanship. And then the third poem that he mentions is Love 3 of George Herbert. So, coming to the end of this essay, Seamus Heaney says that the Oxford English Dictionary displays 4 entries or 4 meanings for the word redress as a noun. And the first of those meanings, the first sense which Heaney employed in this essay was that of reparation, satisfaction, or compensation for a wrong sustained or the loss resulting from this. So that was the first sense of redress that Seamus Heaney employed in this essay. That is how poetry can repair whatever is damaged. And we talked about this, that poetry comes to repair whatever is faulty in this world by projecting an ideal world, an imagined world, which not only is free of all these problems or miseries, but it also lets us understand our position in the world. And for redress as a verb, Seamus Heaney has also used the verb sense of the word redress, and the meaning that he employed in this essay was to set upright again. So naturally Seamus Heaney, through this conception of that fully realized poetry, tends to redress whatever is wrong, whatever is exacerbating. So it tends to set upright again whatever is toppled down. It tends to raise to an erect position again whatever is dropped down. Raise, restore, or establish. So, concluding, Seamus Heaney says that poetry, fully realized poetry, should not be limited to particular cultural, social, political concerns or causes, because then it will become a propaganda. Rather, poetry should, for its redressing effect, poetry should be kept on applying to newer and newer concepts as well. It should not be stereotypically limited to a particular set of concerns. Its scope should be as wide as possible. It is as wide as possible for truly realized poetry. And so this kind of poetry, what it should do is that fully realized poetry, it should have 2 elements in it. It should have the element of surprise when a poet touches upon a new subject or a new theme, and it should have an element of reliability to redress usual wrongs, usual problems, usual concerns, usual political, cultural, social, ethnic concerns. So at the same time that it has been found reliable to redress those issues, it should not be limited to just those issues. Rather, its application should be wide open for newer issues as and when they arise, and that will constitute its surprise element. So surprise and reliability are 2 of the elements that poetry must embody if it has to establish its own redress as a category, as its own separate category. And the truly realized poetry, it gives us the physical emotion, it animates us, it thrills us, and all our faculties are stimulated all at once when we get to read that fully realized poetry. That is also redressed by redressing effect of poetry, or redressed by poetry. And there's another sense of the word redress. It is in the sense of a verb, which is obsolete now, by the way, but its sense is it's in the sense of bringing back to the proper course. Now, this is an obsolete sense. in its verb usage of the word redress, to bring back to the proper course. But Seamus Heaney applies this sense as well to the redressing effect of poetry, that the purpose of poetry, the redressing of effect of poetry, should be to bring to a proper course the innate capacity of the reader as well as the poet. The innate capacity must be channelized. We talked about earlier that poetry is violence from within, which protects us from violence without. Why? Because inner emotions get channelized, they get an outlet for expression, and that is why we don't resort to external violence. So poetry, the redressing effect of poetry, is also to bring back to the proper course internal capacities and the breakaway of their internal capacities, so that they can realize their true potential. That is the redressing effect of poetry on the reader. That is what you'll be called on. Herbert, like I mentioned earlier, is the prime example of the poets that have produced fully realized poetry of this kind, having this fully realized form of redressing effect of his poetry, as we discussed
earlier, which is that to bring back to the proper course all the innate energies, innate capacities, and also to raise again, to erect or to set up whatever has been toppled down, whatever is upside down in this world, or to repair whatever is wrong in this world, to try to compensate for that by projecting an ideal world which makes us understand our real dilemmas and the complete picture as a whole. So that kind of poetry animates us and stimulates us to the core, which is a memorable and embracing experience. So only that fully realized kind of poetry can stimulate us and excite us with the proper physical emotion. And George Herbert's strength was his use of winding forms and woven metaphors, and then his proportion, base, and measure. These also constituted to his literary achievement and to his fully realized poetry, which Seamus Heaney is highly appreciative of. And according to Seamus Heaney, his poetry brings the reader's innate capacity, or the spirit of the reader, to the proper course. And that, the concluding line of Seamus Heaney's essay, is that in this way, George Herbert's work exemplifies the redress of poetry at its most exquisite. Why? Why does George Herbert's work exemplifies the true redress of poetry? The true redress of poetry in the sense of enabling reader to recover a past or prefigure a future, because it excites the reader with that physical emotion, the physical emotion which lets the reader's spirit or innate capacity to wind up on the proper course. And that, according to Seamus Heaney, is a memorable and embracing experience, when the spirit is moved and touched by fully realized poetry of such kind as George Herbert's. This is another redressing effect of poetry, reparation of poetry. So for the most part of this lecture, we studied what the redressing effects of poetry are, what are the benefits that could be constituted, the compensations, the reparations that could be made by poetry. So what can poetry repair in this world or in our lives? And only for a brief portion in the middle, we discussed how poetry needs to be redressed as its own kind by not limiting it to specific social, cultural, ethnic concerns. So poetry should not be limited, poetry's scope should be wide. It should be all-inclusive. Why? Because reality is complex, and it should be comprehensive of the complex reality. It should be all-inclusive, not just limited to particular causes, but showing the complete picture. In that way, we can redress poetry as poetry and establish it as its own kind. So these are the two senses of the word redress, two main senses that were discussed by Seamus Heaney in this essay. I hope that you like this video lecture and that it would be helpful for your understanding of Seamus Heaney's this essay. I've just left out on two things. You need to go through the text of the essay to read in detail about George Herbert's works that have been quoted in this essay, like for his poems The Pulley, Love 3, and The Collar. And you need to point out the elements which Seamus Heaney clearly establishes as the points that make George Herbert's poetry as truly representative of that fully realized poetry. So you will have to do some work on that. I've left that portion out for you guys. And another important question is on Seamus Heaney's style. And we've seen that Seamus Heaney's style is referential, it is elusive, it is historical, it is aphoristic as well. Seamus Heaney's employed many aphorisms in this lecture, in this essay. Then it is cross-argumentative. right? So he gives one argument of some critic, some allegation against poetry, then he gives his counter argument, and the chain goes on and on. His style is rational, scientific, and logical as well. And logical and rational, based on the dialectic of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So these two questions you would have to do all by yourself. Seamus Heaney's style, and George Herbert as the true manifestation of exemplifying the true redress of poetry through his fully realized poetry. I hope that this video lecture was helpful. Till next time, it's goodbye.